How's it going, guys? Today we're going to be starting our part 5 of the Python beginner series. And in this tutorial, in this part of the series, we're going to be looking at lists, tuples, sets, and dictionaries. So to start off, all of these lists, tuples, sets, and dictionaries are just data types that are in Pythons, and they have their own uses. So here we have an example of a Python list, and this is how you define it. This is the variable name, and you assign it, and these are square brackets with double quotes. You can see that these are strings, and each element is separated by a comma. So this Python list is a list because it's encased in square brackets, and it has 3 items, right? 3 elements in them, and they're separated by commas. And each of these elements in this case are strings. So to get a better idea of how to work with lists, let's see what happens. Well, let's just run it when we used to Python list. So syntax, everything works fine. And if we printed Python list here, we can see that it prints with square brackets and the corresponding elements, which is book, video, and audio. And remember, in this case, it's strings, and these could also be integers or booleans that I talked about in part 2, but we'll get more into that later. Now, things that you can do in a list. Now, first thing you can do in a list is access them. Well, how would I access book? Well, book in Python is actually seen as the 0th element. And how you access the 0th element, you have the variable name, which is a Python list, which is a list. Actually, before we get into accessing elements, if we just check what type this is how we all start our tutorials. You see that this has its own data type, which is a list. And if we wanted to access the first element, book, in Python, we start at 0. So that means if we access the first element, we would have the square brackets in here, right? We have the variable name, square brackets, and this is what they call an index. So if I put a 0 here, we can see that book comes back. If we add a 1 here, video will come back, right? So in English, we might think this is the first element, and this is the second element, and this is the third element, which is true, but in Python, we start at 0. And these numbers are called indexes, right? So if I wanted to access audiobook, instead of putting in 3 here, I would actually put 2 because we started at 0. I hope that makes sense. One more. So what happens if I try to access outside of the index, right? So we have 0, 1, 2, right? But what if we try to access Python, the 4th element in this case? Well, like it says, list index out of range, and well, that just means we don't have a 4th element here, and you're accessing an index that is out of the range, and our range in this case is 0, 1, 2, right? However, what you can do is put in certain negative values. So let's see what happened here. If I put in a -1 here, it actually goes back to the end of the list, which gives me audiobook, right? So 0 gives me book, and if imagining this loops back, this gives me audiobook. So you can imagine -2 gives me back video, -3 gives me back book. And again, -4 should be out of range because -4 does not exist. Well, why would anyone put a negative number? How does this even make sense? Well, this is useful when you don't know the length of the list, right? So remember, if we check the length of this list, 3, we know the list here is 3, but what if the length is like 107 and we didn't know the length of this list? If we did Python list -1, well, we will certainly get the last element in the list. So that's where the -1 becomes useful. Other things we can do with a list, we can change it. Let's just say we wanted to change. So this is video. We're changing the element video because it's the second element. And we wanted to change it to videos, right? So So let's see what happens here. Now, if I commented this out, right, if we printed Python list, we have book, video, audiobook. But if I uncommented this line, we see that we have book, videos, and audiobook, right? We added the S there. So you can change each of these elements at your will. That's one of the things you can do with Python lists. And so I can also change the second one to, you know, whatever I want. Let's just say audio books, right? So you see that we added an S there. So that's the second use case. Other things we can do is we can actually add other data types into the list and not just strings, right? So we can actually add, right, this is an integer, this is a boolean, right? We talked about integers last part, and we talked about booleans in a bit of the last part and part 2. We can even put floats, right? And there's a lot of other things we can put. So you can see there's no issues here, right? You can even change. So so this is the 5th element. So this is if we're indexing it by 4, we're talking about the 5th element, and we can change it to false if we wanted to, right? We can change it to any data type we like. Let's just say we can even change it to books. We can even change it to another list, right? So let's just say we had another list, Python list. Let's just call it list with 2 T's, and then we had, you know, books in here. An element could also be a Python list, right? So you can see how our first element is book, which is a string. This is a string. This is a string, integer, and a list, right? And we have an integer. Now you can start imagining we can have a list nested inside a list, nested inside a list, right? All over and over again. So that's how you work with a list in Python. Another thing, the second thing I'll be talking about is a tuple. Let's call this tuple. And what's a tuple? Tuple is very, very similar to a list, except the only difference is you cannot change it, right? So let's just double check that we are working with a tuple here. First of all, a tuple has to be initialized with round brackets instead of square brackets. That's the big difference. And the square brackets, we'll be talking about lists. With a tuple, we're talking about round brackets. And the only difference is that you cannot change each of these elements. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's just try to do what we did back in when we tried to manipulate our list, right? Before we tried to change our first element video to videos, right? But now we're working with a tuple. Let's see what happens. Well, this is not allowed because tuple does not support item assignment, which means we cannot change these elements. So that's the biggest difference. Everything else works exactly the same, right? Length, there should be 3. And data types, we already know what data type this is because we checked with type. This is a class tuple. That is really only the biggest difference. Oh, one more thing to mention is a list and a tuple allows for duplicates. So if I added a duplicate here, right, we have a video, an element that's we'll have data type string called video, and we have another element, the last element that I just added is also a type string called video. We see that this works fine. And if I did the same thing as a list, you can see that this is also true, right? So, but again, the difference between a tuple and a list is that a list cannot sorry, a list can have its elements changed, but a tuple cannot have its elements changed. And you can't access certain elements in a tuple because you can't. So in Python list I can access the 0th index, right, which gives me back book, but a tuple we cannot access the same way. And we'll show how to access these elements in the next video when we talk about, loops. Maybe part 7 we'll do loops, but for now you cannot change it. The third thing that I mentioned in the beginning of the video is a set, right? A set, well, how do you initialize a set? A set is initialized with curly brackets, okay? And this is the same, dissimilar to a tuple in a way that it cannot be changed, right? We can see that if I try changing Python set, like this won't even run because we cannot index it, right? It cannot be changed and cannot be indexed, right? So what does this differ to a tuple then, right? Because we know that a tuple is different from a list and the set is different, must be different from a tuple. Well, in a set you can't have duplicates. Now this won't run an error, okay? So I added a duplicate here. This and this is a duplicate, right? See what happens here. This actually pretended that this didn't exist, right? So there's no video at the end. We added 2 videos, but it doesn't exist. If I added another one, it doesn't exist. It might be in a different order, but it's still the same. It's still the same elements. So why is that? Well, because set doesn't allow duplicates. Even if you added duplicates, you can think of it as it looks through all these elements and it picks out the unique ones, right? So it sees book, it sees video, it sees audiobook. Okay, we have length of 3, and then we see video again, right? Python sees video again and says we already have that, we already have this, we already have this. So we do not allow duplicates in sets. That is the biggest difference in sets. And finally, do remember that length works on all lists, tuples, and sets. There are built-in functions that work for all 3 of these, but they do have their own differences. So the last thing I want to quickly show is actually we will save dictionaries in the next part, but that is Python list, tuple, and set. And one last thing is you can also initialize a list. Instead of using square brackets, we say list and we use double round brackets. Similar for tuples, we can do the same thing, right? Tuple, and this is exactly the same thing. It does not change anything. Okay, these are just 2 different ways of initializing lists and tuples. You can see here, right? Nothing has changed. Nothing has changed. Okay, and you can see that this is a tuple, this is a round bracket. So if you have any questions, please leave them down in the comments. If I've made a mistake or missed something very important, also leave it down in the comments. And if you like this video, give it a like. If you like the content that I'm providing on this channel, please do subscribe. And I hope to see you in the next part of this series. Thanks for watching.